Hey there team, this is E with Alder Creek Kayak Canoe. Today I'm going to take you through joining two halves of a paddle together. This particular one came as a set, so new paddle, never been paddled with, but came in half. But the same process will work if you ended up breaking a paddle and need to glue it back together. First thing you'll want to know is the inner diameter of your shaft here to figure out what sort of size splint you need. So this guy will fit in here pretty well, maybe a little loose because this is oval and this is round, but I like cutting these into about a 6-inch-ish length and then marking it in half when I put it in, so it's about 3 inches in each half of the paddle. Second thing that you'll want to know before you start gluing things is how long you want your paddle to be. This one right now is like a 205. That's a little long for this intended purpose, so I actually need to cut this down by a couple centimeters and make this the proper length for the end user. So the way I normally do it is I'll measure half, figure out what's half of the length I want, cut it off there, and do the same thing on the other half, so that the seam is right in the middle and I can cover that up easily. Alright, so I know that the end user is going to want their paddle be at a 197, so that's in centimeters for the length of the paddle. Sadly, my ruler is only in inches, so I had to convert that to 38.75 inches per half to make it that proper length for the paddler. So I like adding some tape, measuring it out, and then I'll mark it with a Sharpie. And then I'm gonna draw a line around it to make sure that my cut is straight and that I know where what length this paddle will be. Alright, so I cut both halves to be the proper length to make this paddle the length I want it to be. If you have a broken paddle, you might actually be shortening the length of paddle you have to get rid of all the cracks in it. So that's just something to note. But you're trying to cut it as straight as possible. I like cutting it with some tape and wearing a respirator because I don't want to be breathing that stuff in. Next part of getting the paddle glued together is prepping your splint. So I need to sand this and make it so that when I try and slide it in here, the epoxy will actually grip onto this and grip onto the inside here. So I normally sand the inside of the shaft and sand the outside of this, and then I mark the halfway point. So this is about a 6-inch tubing. I'm going to find about 3 inches, mark it, glue it in, and I'll show you the process of that. So yeah, you're just trying to sand to rough up the surface, give the epoxy something to grab onto. You don't need to use the highest grit sandpaper in the world. I think this is like 80 or something like that. 40. So like, you just want it to rough up the surface. Take the shaft and the glue will hold on to each other. So that's pretty much all you need on that. And if you're smart, you can actually get this all the way in there. I'm actually going to switch over to higher grit just so that it's a little bit easier to get in here. All right, so I measured to the halfway point right there of this little splint I'm going to be using so that when it gets inserted into the shaft, it stops right here. I'm going to use some G-Flex and glue this in. I want to make sure that I'm gluing about halfway in so that I can save the other half to go in the other part of the paddle. When gluing, you kind of want to be, use a little bit more than you think. Because you want a really good connection. I like putting glue on the outside of the spigot and then on the inside of the shaft to make sure that it gets a really firm grip. You want to use some thicker epoxy, not something very liquidy, because you don't want this sliding around as it's drying, and you want to kind of take up all the extra space that's in here. If you have a more rounded shaft on the inside, you might not need to worry about the taping part, but I'm going to tape this in here after I get some glue. I like using G-Flex, and I'm going to mix it up in a little Dixie cup, put some in here, put some on the shaft, well, put some on the spigot, and then leave this overnight, and then we will continue tomorrow. And when I try and get this in, spin it as I do so. So I'm really wanting to make sure that all of this is covered. And that it will be making a really good connection. Now with the epoxy dry, I can take off the tape, slide the other half of the paddle on, mark where I want the feather and all of that on the paddle. You can either use a jig of another paddle you already know the angle of, or there's really cool little equation that you can use to figure out how to mark it for yourself if you don't already have a paddle that has the angle you want. Here we are at the 30-degree mark, right hand. Have this big old line here. If I were to bring this shorter line up, this would be 0-degree offset. So 30-degree offset right there. And I actually use just a little bit less than I do when I do the first half, because if there's any spillage, it's a little bit harder to clean up. But that should be good there. Grab the other half. A little bit. All right. Fun part. right, so I'm making sure that this stays lined up and making sure that there aren't any gaps, or any large gaps really. I'm also making sure that there's not going to be any like weird offset in the middle here, so that it's going to be a smooth transition. I'm making it as good as I can, but sometimes you just can't help but have it be a little wonky. Okay, with being clamped and taped overnight, we know it's dry, it's ready to go. We just need to take all the tape off, check out our joint, see how it dried, and if it is good to go, or if we need to make any tweaks. So we can see now with most of the tape off that the joint is a little offset, mainly because each half is oval and we had a circular tube in the middle, so we couldn't get it lined up quite perfectly, but it's good enough. If yours was like a little bit more crooked, or you could really feel this a lot more, you might want to go over this with some epoxy to kind of smooth it all out, sand it down. For me, I feel like this is good enough. The tape that we're going to use is going to cover this well enough that no one will be the wiser. I like using electrical tape. You can use any tape that your heart desires. Or if before you glue this together, you can add on a piece of shrink tubage onto one side or the other. And then once it's all glued on, you just slide it over, heat it up, and it'll cinch on down. I like electrical tape because if I need to take it off, it's a lot easier. I do a little swirl over, and then I cap the ends with another piece of electrical tape to make sure it doesn't come undone. All right, thanks for coming along with the journey of joining two paddle halves together. Again, this will work if you broke a paddle and you need to glue it together, or if you're just trying to make a paddle of your own. Super simple, really fast. Anyone can really do it. So thanks for following along.